Sadia Hartman writes, "The undoing of the plot begins with her runaway tongue, with her outstretched hands, with songs shared across the unfreed territory and the occupied lands, with pledges of love that propel struggle, with the vision that this bitter earth may not be what it seems." This beginning, the start of this undoing, is the last sentence of her short 2020 essay, The Plot of Her Undoing, which collects a series of beginnings that mark out the catastrophes of capitalism, chattel slavery, colonialism, vertical hierarchies of gender, race, class, sexuality, nation, ability, that make the uneven distribution of death in repetition of its formation. The plot of her undoing begins with, she begins again and again to be plotted, to be undone, until the plot itself begins to be undone. The undoing of the plot begins with, its undoing is what we're working for, planning, plotting, the vision that this bitter earth may not be what it seems, that we may see and see undone what the plot has wrought. A runaway tongue, a runaway plot, as Hartman writes elsewhere, notes for the riot, an outline draft in the midst of open rebellion. This drafting we might follow to read the relationship between story and domination, craft an undoing vision of plot and plot. The concepts of plot and implotment have been taken up by scholars such as Ricoeur, Hayden White, Reinhard Koselleck, David Scott, in efforts to understand the contingent shaping of narrative and historical knowledge, as well as the civilizational and racial projects such knowledges produce. Scott argues that implotment names the idea that the way we structure the past, setting in motion present longing for a particular kind of future, is the answer to some often unspoken question or desire that wields structuring power. I'm also interested in how we can read the uses of history in and through the process by which historical stories are consolidated in powerful institutions, moments, and processes by which historical stories are, by which practices of life-making in the wake of mass and colonial violence, as well as in the course of the ways that violence is narrated and thereby shapes reality, are tempered by the accessibility of resources, both language and narrative, as well as material sustenance, refuge, recognition, repair. Some of my script lacks order, which kind of makes sense with the theme. Plot, Paul Ricoeur suggests, is in the first of his texts on time and narrative, grasps together and integrates into one whole and complete story, multiple and scattered events, thereby schematizing the intelligible signification attached to the narrative taken as a whole. Reading Aristotle's conception of plot as mimesis via his treatise on tragedy in the Poetics, Ricoeur elaborates plot as the imitating or representation of action and the organizing of events. He proposes that plot is a work of synthesis. By means of plot, goals, causes, and chance are brought together with temporal unity of a whole and complete action. Here, the plot appears as the first principle, the purpose, the end, and thereby Ricoeur extends the soul of tragedy. Yet given the theme of this symposium, I am of course struck by this listing, the alignment of ends as purpose and soul of the historical and literary narrative form of tragedy, one formation of plot. If plot is the end, the purpose, the place and time to which we are propelled, what does it have to do with democracy? A political conception of plot in the context of the ends of democracy perhaps most clearly evokes contemporary conditions of illegal or harmful collective conspiracy, intent, a plan made in secret. The US white supremacist right wing is plotting. The coagulating plots that lead to the US October 8th insurrection mark the rise of fascism and national and global fruition, alongside the popular power of Erdogan, Modi, Le Pen, Bolsonaro, Prabowo, Trump again. Democracy, we fear, ends with the ostensible promise after the Cold War, the end of history and capitalist democratic order as the good life to the exclusion of all other possibilities. In the face of the kinds of genocidal violence we today confront in Palestine, in Sudan, in the mass disabling events of pandemics, transportation collapse, and the environmental catastrophes our state institutions would rather narrate as the impact of trans children and DEI initiatives, we have lost, or perhaps found, the plot. This week, in the face of Trump's administration's layoff of roughly 1,000 members of the National Park Service permanent workforce and the since reverse firing of several thousand seasonal workers, a group of 12 protesters hung a flag upside down on the face of El Capitan at Yosemite National Park to coincide with the influx of park visitors as Horsetail Waterfall transforms into Yosemite Firefall each February, the water glowing red across a 30,000-foot cliff face. The firing was part of a multi-agency purge of tens of thousands of probationary federal employees, mostly people in the first couple of years of their career who have fewer job protections. The flag, according to the American Legion U.S. Flag Code, should never be displayed with the Union down except as a signal of dire distress in instances of extreme danger to life or property. The protesting group put out a statement. The Department of the Interior issued a series of secretarial orders that positioned drilling and mining interests as the favored uses of America's public lands and threatened to scrap existing land protections and conservation measures, firing thousands of staff regardless of position or performance across the nation. This is the first step to disabling the protections in place for these great places. We are shining a spotlight by putting a distress flag on El Capitan in view of firefall. Think of it as your public lands on strike. One protester, Gavin Carpenter, continues, we're bringing attention to what's happening in the parks, which are every American's properties. In response, Jolie Varela, Numu or Paiute, and Yokot cultural worker with ancestral homelands in Payahunadu in what are known as California and the High Sierras, who appear publicly on Instagram and elsewhere as Indigenous Women Hike, writes, when I see the United States flag flying in distress on our ancestral lands, I cannot help but feel that this has always been the plot. While this is a symbol of distress, it is also a symbol of the theft of native lands and the attempted genocide of native peoples. I cannot help but feel this has always been the plot. Varela marks out both legislation and enforcement of orders that expand the reach of resource extraction from and destruction of her ancestral homelands as continuities of settler colonial dispossession, as well as the more local act of hanging the flag itself. This has always been the plot. The theft of native lands and the attempted genocide of native peoples, presuming the entanglement of these acts. The flag as the specific occasion for a reading of plot. I'm curious in this, my occasion here with you all, to reflect on the political concept about the extent to which utterances of democracy under threat, the worry over democracy's end as finish, may contribute to the plot. I'll say again, I'm curious about the extent to which utterances of democracy under threat may contribute to the plot. Moving through these times as continuities of democratic and racial capitalist founding in the US nation state and its imperial extensions, how might it behoove us to consider a relation of plot and plot, domination and story? After Hartman, I gather a series of beginnings toward undoing the plot. My reading is inflected with interdisciplinary intellectual and material debts, in particular to Cambodian feminist scholars, artists, and practitioners, Yideng Trung, Kathy Schlen-Viles, Linda Safan, Borit Lee, Lena Chan, Anthony V. Sasso, June Cooch. The work they do alongside interlocutors, friends, and comrades brings together longstanding and multiply rooted women of color feminist reading practices, centering a relational critique of the histories and hauntings we not only study, but differently live within. In plot as a political concept, in lineages of narrative, Black feminist and critical, and women of color feminist theory, I consider plot as a political concept in order to unpack the ordering force of storytelling as a specific imperial strategy in the repertoire of fascist domination we today face as a threat to the possibilities of democracy and collectively determined future. In this sense, I'm less interested in whether the narrative plotting of history is inevitable or somehow wrong in itself. Hayden White argues that the basis for utilizing one form of implotment or another is a moral or aesthetic choice rather than an epistemological claim to greater accuracy or truth. Undertaking these methodological interventions raises the question of who or what has devised the plot, from what theoretical and historical position, within what lexical commitments and explanatory modalities, and centrally, what meaning is imbued in this order as a problem of knowledge. As such, in this paper, I examine plot as a political concept in valences of knowledge, expressive culture, as the understandings of lived material conditions, relationships to story, are held by racialized and third world communities who know from experience. Where literary plot marks the sequence of a story's main event, the plottings of power frequently undertake distinct yet entwined narrative arcs in their attempted formulation of racialized, gendered, and colonized lifeways. A digression, in literary terms, where perhaps a detour or a trapdoor is more appropriate in spatial ones. Plot likewise names a spatial relation. Where is the plot? Ruth Wilson Gilmore considers implotment the geographic ordering of space and the narrative ordering of time, entwined like a double helix or Mobius strip. Gilmore here opens space for unpacking how plot organizes space and time, brings narrative and order to both. Plot indicates the history in which we are likely to find ourselves. This formation falls on the works of Sylvia Wynter and Catherine McKittrick, who consider the co-constitution of the plantation and the West Indian literary novel. Wynter holds the plot also has a history. Kanisha Passard writes after Wynter, she argues that the plot of the West Indian novel shares a spirit with the provision grounds, those small plots of land that the people of African descent cultivated in the shadow of the plantation, spaces of use value where one grows for one's own nourishment rather than for the market, as well as a place from which people of African descent mounted guerrilla resistance. Honoring this formulation, Gilmore places plot as a political concept at the nexus of material and representational power within the grips of colonial and racial capitalist violence and possible seizure in the course of anti-colonial struggle. Another wrinkle of the material. Southeast Asian artist and historian Viet Le characterizes such efforts in part as working with the remains. He defines remains as the real and spectral bodies alive and dead and in between. Remains are also the traces of what is left behind, resuscitated in collective and individual memory and history. In this way, he is also talking about an operation of metonymy, taking such remains as a stand-in for the whole of the violence as such remains may reference. The whole standing in for the part is a specific literary mechanism that communicates meaning and immediacy with immediacy and alacrity. The crown is the king, the map is the nation, the skull is the violence, the woman is the state, the disease is the violence, in particular explaining its trajectory and historical path. However, such substitution may be fundamentally misleading. As Leigh's definition reminds us, the traces of violence are neither simply material or mnemonic, but likewise represent structurally manipulated, historically contingent, non- and more than human formations. What remains are visible as the runes or truly still operating materiality of violence, thus may also mark a key operation of governance in masquerading as representative of the whole. This figurative collapse is one form of historical plot. Plot as order, story, plot as predictive charting, plot as conspiracy, plot as parcel of land. With whom, where, when, and how does the plot begin undoing? The plot of her undoing attempts to withhold this knowledge, writes such knowledge out of the story. Where story kills, proffers domination, we write to undo the plot. The plot in question for me today. The 1984 film, The Killing Fields, its story, its making, its movements of plot and plot. The life and love story associated with Khmer American refugee actor Dr. Hang Asnau centrally stages these concerns and, I believe, begins the undoing of the plot. Looking to the 1984 film, The Killing Fields, in which Noor stars, I'm going to take us through key moments in the practical production, dissemination, and afterlife of the film. The film sits at the intersection of US empire, liberal and neoliberal racial and gendered projects, and circuits of capital. At the same time, I propose it proffers an utterance of democracy's ends, its plots. This is the plot. The Killing Field tells the story of a friendship between white American New York Times journalist Sidney Schamberg, played by Sam Watterson, and his Cambodian fixer and later fellow journalist Dith Pran, played by Dr. Hang Asnor. The film is based on Schamberg's 1980 New York Times Magazine article detailing his work and friendship with Dith, reporting on violence in Cambodia and the American bombing campaign, how Dith saved Schamberg's life from the Khmer Rouge, before Schamberg ultimately fails to save Dith from living through the horrors of the Khmer Rouge era. The article is published in January 1980, just after they are astoundingly reunited at the Thai border in Khao Dang refugee camp. The movie is filmed in 82 and 83, primarily in Thailand, with some scenes in the US and UK, and comes out in 84 to widespread acclaim. It stays among the top 10 highest earning films in the US for over 6 months and is nominated for 7 Academy Awards, including most famously that won by Dr. Noor. It's an immediate commercial and popular success and the first major international representation of what would come to be later known as the Cambodian genocide. A large part of this acclaim gets routed through the film's drive toward accuracy, its performance of documentation, its mimetic qualities. Describing the film, foremost Cambodian area studies historian David Chandler writes, "The Killing Field is moving, meticulous, and persuasive. The film succeeds at history," end quote. This triumphalist judgment of historical narrative order and mise en scene marks the representational project as expert approved. To achieve this verisimilitude, filmmakers enlist the help of state military facilities, equipment, and authorization. Upon realizing that the Thai military couldn't supply the helicopters needed to replicate the evacuation of the US Embassy in '75, the airlift, the production team requested the use of 6 American Marine helicopters in October 1983. The team convinces military officials in part by arguing for the careful research that has gone into the film, as well as the positive impact the film will have. They argue the Killing Fields concerns the human tragedy of refugees and fugitives from war, that gala charity premieres throughout the world would benefit many aid organizations. The move to plot, to purvey mimesis, is oriented toward material benefit for aid organizations and will therefore support people grappling with the violence the film presents, the filmmakers argue. Yet the film's story is consolidated within structures of domination that condition its production. The US Department of Defense agrees to cooperate. The film's associate producer, Ian Smith, responsible for negotiations, writes, "I must tell you that we received maximum cooperation and assistance from the US Marine Corps, in particular Major Pat Coulter and Captain A.L. Hansen, who truly worked like Trojans on our behalf." I still don't know what that means. The helicopters performed marvelously. As such, the benevolent knowledge production and dissemination that the film enacts are thus indispensably tied to infrastructures of state violence. That is, more than building on the collateral damage of violence and war, attempting to represent this violence with its ruins, the movie is materially continuous with war itself. From the state's perspective, a clear question of narrative authorization and production within structures of domination that utter democracy's ends arises. Even as the US military may condemn the Khmer Rouge, support films that display them as the purest, most brutal communist regime in history, and are apparently critical of US failure to intervene in the Cambodian genocide, the Khmer Rouge are also the recipients of $85 million in US lethal and non-lethal, ostensibly anti-communist aid from 1980 to 85 alone, as a counterbalance to communist Vietnamese rule. The film holds this plot in its very moves toward accuracy. The performance of accuracy rests also on the actors themselves. The majority of the cast was Thai, Southeast Asian, but accessible to casting agents in a way that the ongoing war in Cambodia disallowed. However, Khmer-speaking roles necessitated Cambodian actors. And of course, casting the Cambodian lead, Dit Pran, presented the greatest challenge. In my interview with casting director Pat Golden, she details an intense and immersive search in more than 6 US cities. As one of the only Black women working in her level at casting, Golden notes the importance for her in casting a Cambodian person in the lead, and her disagreements with director Jaffe to keep looking when the search proved difficult. Most of the Cambodian people she met were refugees and, quote, had more important things on their mind than acting. She meets Dr. Hengus Noor at a wedding in a temporary refugee housing in California. He's working at the time at a refugee advocacy org. He emigrated himself in 1980 with the passage of the Refugee Act in that year. He had survived the genocide, but lost most of his family, including his fiancée, who was pregnant with their child. He refuses to do the audition, doesn't show up for his appointment twice, professes extreme reluctance to take part in the production. Really, the reason I hadn't wanted the job, Noor writes later, didn't have anything to do with losing face or not being offered the part. I hadn't wanted to bring back the suffering. There were enough reminders already. Eventually, the filmmakers persuade him to read for them. Jaffe narrates, "I got him to talk through what had happened when he was in the operating theater and had seen the Khmer Rouge approaching. We must go, I'm telling you, go." Then he burst into tears. "Hung," I said, "you have to do this film. There is a voice for Cambodia, and you are that voice. It's your duty to bring it to the world." It was quite a horrible, manipulative thing to say. This is still Jaffe about himself. During shooting, I would sometimes crawl below the camera and call out to him, "Remember how you felt." He was such a brave man. Noor almost doesn't make it to Thailand for filming. His passport is marked stateless, and only when he arrives there does he learn that he's actually playing the Cambodian lead. He makes deep friendships with fellow actors, yet the work is grueling. Noor, in his autobiography, narrates the harsh and repetitive extractions he faced in the course of filming. Jaffe pushes Noor to repeat scenes that reference his own experiences of genocide, even where Noor says he can't go on. Noor advises on the film's historical precision. Though Jaffe changes much about the film to include Noor's suggestion for accuracy, Noor writes, He refused, though, when I asked him to show the Khmer Rouge whipping the men pulling the plow. I felt the film should be more violent to show what the Khmer Rouge were really like, but Roland did not agree. In terms of historical accuracy, I was right. In terms of knowing what the movie audiences would tolerate, he was. If the film had shown how bad things really were, under the Khmer Rouge, Westerners would have refused to see it. The process of knowledge production happens under conditions in which those who have lived through these events are not the ultimate authority on them. And I think quite clearly shows them to be objects of extraction and sometimes to which violence is done. At one point, due to prop malfunction, Noor is physically beaten in filming a scene. In order for this film to achieve accurate and affecting portrayal of violence, succeed at history as Chandler assesses, it requires Noor to experience violence at a variety of registers. The plotting of the historical narrative then communicates not only the importance of these events, but also in some fundamental way the unimportance of Cambodian people in colonial, capitalist, and white supremacist grammars. The stakes of the film are highlighted by the scene of the Academy Awards itself, when Dr. Noor wins Best Supporting Actor in 1985. He is the first person of Asian descent to win it. This is unbelievable, but so is my whole life, Noor says in a joyous acceptance speech. It's a momentous scene in his life, in Hollywood, for Khmer communities globally, yet he's handed the Golden Oscar Award by white actor Linda Hunt, who herself won Best Supporting Actress the year before for her racist, yellow-faced portrayal of a Chinese man, a different photographer in a different Cold War film set in Southeast Asia. The juxtaposition of consuming and praising racist visual culture alongside celebrating the, quote, untrained talent of a grateful and gainfully employed refugee is stark. For our story, this scene marks the plot. The deep compatibility of a politics of seemingly just profusion of knowledge about violence with regimes that consolidate Asian people, including Noor, as feminized, irrational, dominable, and indeed objects to which violence can be done with impunity in larger schema of US empire. This relationship of story and domination is perhaps most horribly encapsulated by the conditions under which Dr. Noor was murdered in 1996. 12 years after the release of the film, amidst his continuing advocacy for Cambodian refugees and survivors both in the US and Cambodia, he is killed outside his home in Chinatown, LA. The key to the Mercedes-Benz was on the floor of the car. Almost $4,000 in cash was found on or near his body. Despite these suspicious circumstances, the LAPD finds that it is a robbery, attributing his murder to local Khmer gang violence. However, the local Cambodian community, and later many in Cambodia, know that he was assassinated by the Khmer Rouge, an intuition confirmed at the Khmer Rouge tribunals themselves by the first Khmer Rouge leader on trial. This is the plot. It has always been so. We know this is the plot within what may now be cast as conspiracy. In an attempt to support the rule of Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines against Corazon Aquino in the February 1986 election, CIA forces organized mass screenings of the killing fields. One counterinsurgency document notes, the military has scored several public relations successes in the last year, despite public cynicism and resource constraints. Among the more notable achievements were establishment of a defense military propaganda unit and the showing of the movie The Killing Fields by AFP Civil Relations Service field personnel as part of the effort to increase public awareness of the dangers of a communist victory. In this way, it is at least in part clear what knowledge the state reads as emanating centrally from the film. It's here a means of shaping a Filipinx public and potentially influencing their perceptions of national politics in its representation of communist horror. Knowledge production about the Cambodian genocide effected within the film and the relationships it seeks to cast among audiences here precisely reproduces American military efforts. In this way, the film is framed as a military technology in itself. In contexts of enduring domination, pervasive racial, gendered, colonial logics, institutions, ongoing militarisms, hierarchies of authority that dictate who is subject, who is object of knowledge. In this context, plot intervenes. Plot dictates that knowledge production about violence, marking and mourning democracy's ends, can actually reproduce the very violence it is oriented toward documenting and working against. Knowledge production about mass violence may draw on existing infrastructures of domination and likewise sets in motion harms against those it seeks to support or effect political action for. In this sense, the stories we tell about mass violence can themselves be wielded against survivors, creating violent terrains of living on which they and their kin seek recognition, resources, refuge. Winter, the plot has a history. The film proffers an ordering of hierarchy story ends in the context of enduring domination. With ingratitudes, with runaway thoughts, with shared vision that this bitter earth may not be what it seems, we write to undo the plot. Thank you.